Another quote from Matua: "If the human rights movement is driven by a totalitarian or totalizing impulse, that is, the mission to require that all human societies transform themselves to fit a particular blueprint, then there is an acute shortage of deep reflection and a troubling abundance of zealotry in the human rights community." This is also a rather in-your-face quote, isn't it? So let's oh, okay. I'm not going to try to be comprehensive in outlining all the possible critiques of human rights, because there are a lot of them out there. But this, I think, encapsulates the way many African scholars see it, and indeed the way many anthropologists in the United States see it. I want to just sort of refer to a couple of other lines of critique of human rights. I think, again, Morrison in his article evokes some of these a little bit. There is this... There's an irony from an historical perspective, which is that if World War II and the Holocaust and Hitler were at least part of the impetus for the post-World War II human rights era, it was in response directly to European tyranny, European brutality. And yet, Matua is saying, and he says this in some detail in his article, he says, how did it get to be about Africa? How did it get to be about Asia? If this was initially a self-reflection on the part of Europeans primarily, how did that trajectory, in his view, sort of dead end? And the trajectory instead that got picked up was the colonial trajectory. It became a way for the European powers, the former colonial powers, the United States, to wag their finger and lecture at non-European, non-North American societies. How did that happen? And isn't that a fundamental problem? And certainly the charge of hypocrisy and arrogance has been leveled against us, even in recent years. Certainly the Bush administration got more than its, or perhaps, I was going to say more than its fair share, perhaps its fair share. But that often we in the West are flawed in the way we conduct ourselves, and yet we are much quicker perhaps to criticize others than to reflect on our own behavior. But can we really stop there? If we, it seems to me that, and again, some of my colleagues from the NEH Institute, I think, stopped there and became pessimists about human rights because they saw this conflict as sort of being insoluble. I understand that view and I empathize with it to a certain extent, but this slide really encapsulates what drives me to push the inquiry beyond that, because indeed there are some examples certainly of human rights violations, what I and many people would call human rights violations, that whether they have a Western origin in some sense or some Western bias, at their heart they seem to go far beyond that, and they seem to say something really important about the human spirit, the importance of justice, the integrity of the person, things like that really do, in my mind, seem to go beyond a particular cultural bias. Because my work is on gender-based violence, by which I mean primarily domestic violence, family violence, as well as sexual assault and rape, I'm very sensitized to these issues, and to me they are, in fundamental ways, human rights issues as well. So is there a way to think about these issues that is legitimately transcultural in some way? Can we get beyond this concern about cultural relativism and assert that some forms of brutality, some forms of violence, some forms of oppression really are, in a universal sense, human rights violations? Sally Mary is an anthropologist, a legal anthropologist I respect a lot, and she has helped me to think through some of this. So I want to share a couple of ideas from her and then say a little bit about how I've tried to apply her ideas in my own work. This is a scholar who is deeply committed to cultural relativism, and yet takes a social justice stand when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence. And she says the power of human rights to change the way people think and act is their capacity to change existing cultural practices, such as the husband's authority to discipline his wife through beating. So here she is saying, culture's all well and good, but some things perhaps should change, and the law can be used to change them, and human rights norms can be used to change them. And in fact, just to give you another little brief lesson in what anthropologists say about culture, one of the things we emphasize is cultures change. Culture is not one static, inviolable thing. Cultures change all the time. Anthropologists feel very protective over cultures when the change is imposed from outside. But are there ways to think about cultural change that include human rights, but that at the same time are not just an imposition on a culture? And I'm going to show you a couple of quotes that are going to help to map out where I think that possibility lies. Hold on, somewhere in my notes it says skip this slide, and I have to remember which slide that is. It might be this one, so don't read it yet. I pretty much abandoned my notes, so I'm losing track here. No, okay, this one's okay. You can read this one. Okay. Anthropologists can bring to human rights a better understanding of how change occurs in societies through the interaction amongst power structures and cultural meanings, supporting the notion of culture not as a static arrangement of symbols and ideas, but a changing system. So she's, I think, saying better than I did what I just tried to say, which is that cultures are changing, and perhaps human rights can be used in a way to change them in a positive direction. This is the one you shouldn't read. Okay. Again, going back to Mary, and again, I apologize for the long quotes, but there's some really powerful ideas encapsulated well here, so I think they're worth looking at. And this is Sally Mary again. And I'm going to read this. Okay. In this quote, Mary, I think, is really trying to put across both ideas, this idea of respect for cultural diversity and the compulsion to promulgate human rights. Many have argued that in order for human rights to be culturally legitimate, they must fit into existing normative structures and ways of thinking. In other words, if human rights are going to be meaningful to people, actual people in their actual lives, they're only going to be legitimate if they actually resonate with people's existing beliefs and perceptions and values. Presenting human rights through culturally familiar images and sources of authority, such as the Quran in Islamic societies, facilitates their adoption. So she's trying to suggest a way to think about human rights and culture converging, coming together, but she's trying to map out an alternative to this idea of cultural imposition that's familiar to us from the colonial era. However, but she's not shy about asserting the importance of human rights. However, it is the challenge that human rights conceptions offer to traditional ways of understanding relationships that give them their power to change local legal consciousness. So she's saying human rights should in some way be articulated in a way that's locally meaningful to people, so that they'll accept them, so that they're culturally relevant, so that they're showing some respect for culture, which is important. At the same time, why bother asserting human rights unless you are trying to change minds and change practices? So she's trying to kind of have it both ways here. And I find her pretty persuasive on this point, although it remains a complex issue. And I want to explain to you this very interesting idea, I think very thought-provoking idea that she puts forth here. She talks about vernacularization, which is, it sounds a little bit wordy, verbose to me, but what she means is taking the ideas embodied in the Human Rights Project and translating them into the local vernacular. She's using a linguistic metaphor there. Translating them into the local level so that they are meaningful to people. In order for human rights ideas to be effective, they need to be translated into local terms and situated within local contexts of power and meaning. They need, in other words, to be remade in the vernacular. Examining this process is crucial to understanding the way human rights act in the contemporary world.